Good morning. This is For the Record, and I'm Neil Heinen. This morning, we are beginning what I planned to be as comprehensive a look as possible into what it means to live in what has been described and what the evidence supports as the most racially disparate city in the most racially disparate county in the most racially disparate state in America. We begin with the premise that this is unacceptable. We acknowledge a lot of people are working very hard on this issue. We acknowledge that isn't enough. So we'll talk to as many people as possible over the next weeks or months, the mayor, community leaders, activists, citizens, to try to understand what this means and what must be done. We begin this morning with a conversation with the CEO and president of the Urban League of Greater Madison, Kaleem Caire, and Lisa Payton Caire, founder of the Foundation for Black Women's Wellness. Thank you both very much for joining me this morning.
Thank you for having us.
Kaleem, so statistics include test scores, incarceration rates, employment rates, poverty rates. All are wildly disparate between white and black. Are we, clearly the statistics show that we're the most racially disparate city in America. Are we the most racist city in America?
It's hard to defend that we're not when people make that claim because the data shows and would make you feel that we are. What I think we are is we're probably one of the most elitist cities in America that doesn't like to look at its issues. We don't want to believe that we have anything to do with anything that's wrong in our community, and so we often, over years, have turned a blind eye to it. My family's been here since 1907, and anyone in my family could tell you that that's the way Madison has always behaved when it came to the issue of race. If you look at historical books or documents on Madison that have been written, they'll be voluminous in their understanding of the role that everyone else played, whites played, but people of color were absent virtually in those documents when we had a rich history and a lot of contributions we made here. So Madison has always turned a blind eye to these issues, and we'll battle people down about it too. We don't have those problems. I'll say this, when our Urban League was started in 1968, it took us 5 years and a study done by the National Urban League and another few years to convince people that we actually needed something like this because we did not want to believe that Madison had a race problem.
Kaleem, the Urban League is a diverse organization. It's probably more diverse than it's ever been.
Most diverse in Dane County.
Is this a black and white issue, or do we do a disservice to this conversation by framing it as a black and white issue?
We do. It's a community issue. Every person who lives here is a resident of this community. They are working here. They are taking care of their families here, and we have to treat people like that. At the Urban League, we made a decision when I got here. We had always been somewhat of a diverse organization, but when I got here, I made the decision that we were going to reflect what we desired. And so we are a reflection of Madison, from our board to our staff. And if an all-black organization can achieve that in a town like Madison, other organizations in this city can too. So it's not that we can't get there, it's that we have to have the desire to get there, and we have to put decision-making behind that.
Lisa, how does, from the work that you do, Black women's wellness in particular, but your work in education, your work in the court systems, how is this reflected in your life?
We have a history here in Madison. Of course, Kaleem is born and raised. We moved back here together in 1993 as a young married couple with children, students at the UW, and professionals who were working. And from that point, as a woman in my 20s, working in the social service sector here in Madison and simultaneously raising children and engaging with schools and nonprofit organizations and others, it was immediately evident to me that we had racial gaps in the way people experienced Madison. As a young African-American woman and mother and professional, I most certainly experienced Madison in a way that was very different than how I experienced life on the East Coast, where people were familiar with seeing you, with accepting that you were experienced, competent.
The Washington, D.C. area in particular?
Virginia is my home state,
yep.
So I'm speaking in that context.
Yep.
We left, came back, and so the D.C. context has been our place for the last 9 years before coming back. Same experience. And I learned very quickly that I was operating in a different terrain where people weren't as comfortable talking about race or acknowledging that race was a factor when it was evident in all the arenas that we were interacting in. It became clear to me that African Americans and Latino population, which is growing exponentially here, were experiencing Madison in a way that was outside of the center of opportunity. Although there are enclaves and a growing middle class segment of those communities now, that was less evident, I'd say in the early 90s when we lived here. And even now, though those middle class elements are growing, regardless of where you're stationed or positioned in terms of class or education as a person of color, you simply experience Madison in a different way than your white counterparts.
Intellectually, doesn't that conflict with the idea of the liberal, highly educated, white, progressive community here that you would think is supposed to be broader in their inclusion?
Yeah, it's a gap in understanding. I think that there's an unwillingness to contemplate that there are differences in how we live and engage in institutions and how institutions respond to us. And in my personal line of work now, which deals primarily with health disparities and how they impact African American women specifically in the African American community, to have that conversation with folks that there are many factors that are driving health disparities, and a lot of it is structural. It deals with the quality of life that African American women and others experience when they come, seeking basic necessities in life in terms of housing, in terms of employment, how they're perceived when they enter those spaces, the assumptions that are generated about them, the level of effort that it takes to be seen as a credible, competent person who's legitimate in whatever it is that you're trying to do. Those under the surface issues that are always at play impact the way we engage in just about every institution here in our community, from schools, from workplaces, from going into the grocery store. I tell Kaleem a story. When I was younger, and I've always supposedly looked younger than my age, I'd walk in with my children to any general grocery store, and the way that I was engaged with was as if I had no right to have these children with me. Kind of I tell people, like, I got the black welfare mom response.
Yep.
And the change was, thrown across at the counter to me. Or I'd have 3 young children and I looked relatively young, so I could see and feel the assumptions of, maybe she's not married, maybe she's not employed. And I've been asked on more than one occasion in a doctor's appointment if my children had the same father, because the assumption was there's no way this African-American woman with these children, had these children by the same father. So those experiences that are nonverbal, along with those that we can kind of track more statistically through employment data or school achievement data, they're active and they're operating in our community.
All right, I want to talk about some of that data when we come back right after this.
At 40+ indicators across the board that African Americans here are faring worse, sometimes far worse than African Americans in the nation. And that was what was particularly surprising and alarming, because the concept that a rising tide lifts all boats was not taking place here. In other words, we were actually being tugged as a county. When you're looking at the numbers, whites were being tugged upward and African Americans were, for some reason, being tugged downward.
That from an issue of the Madison Magazine television show, which is still airing on TVW through the month of November, and you can also find it online. This show is a response to that report and other statistics that we've become very familiar with, school achievement data, employment data, all showing disparity in rates between African Americans and whites in Madison, in Dane County, and Wisconsin that are the most disparate in the nation. And we are going to explore that issue over the next weeks and months on this show and in editorials as well. My guests, Kaleem Caire and Lisa Payton Caire. In that first segment, we were beginning to get into some of the structural issues underlying some of this stuff, and I'd like you to talk about that a little bit more, Kaleem. For example, District Attorney Ishmael Ozan has started a couple of efforts at changing the diversion program aimed at fairness, but also aimed at the disparity in incarceration rates. You know what's going on around the schools as well as anybody, and yet it seems like those systemic issues are the toughest ones to get our hands around, and we are failing at doing that. Why?
You know, I'm glad you brought up Ishmael. We grew up together. We've been very good friends for a very long time. And he was one of these young people that if he was born today, you know, his chances of graduating high school would probably be a lot more challenging. You know, he doesn't mind me sharing this. Today, Ishmael struggled with reading when he came to St. James, and we met in 4th grade. But they worked with him, and he worked hard. And he graduated high school. He was our Gatorade Soccer Player of the Year in the state. And, you know, I still, you know, admire his educational pursuit as well as his sports. But we don't want to change the systems here because, again, I think that elitism, that's a part and ingrained in who we are. By saying we have a problem in Madison, for some it feels like saying we are responsible for that problem. And people do not want to take responsibility. Our school was just an example. We talked about doing one school that would be an example, a model, and also a solution for a significant number of kids who are just falling through the cracks in our schools. But again, became a dialogue about, are we saying the schools are terrible? Are we saying Madison's racist? Are we saying that white teachers can't teach black kids? I mean, all of that grew out of a simple solution that we didn't bring those messages to the table. We just talked about the challenge and trying to bring a solution to it. But Madison struggles with this notion of race. So what happens is we'll read about the disparities in the newspaper. We have to convince ourselves that this can't be. Oh, it's got to be someone from Chicago's problem that's come here, and oh, now there's just so many of them coming here. We don't look and see that, well, when they get here, they can't get a job. They struggle getting housing. When they get housing, they're quick to be released from that housing if the slightest little thing goes wrong. Their kids and getting their kids into school, we don't have a way to acclimate their children to the schools. Our community, when you read the newspaper, we have our mayor, for God's sake, who will say, it's the people from Chicago. So if your mayor is saying that, I'm sorry, that's a problem.
Now, this is the same mayor who, within the last week, and I hope to have him on, if not next week, very, very soon, and the last week said that he was going to dedicate what seemed like some significant energy into the jobs situation. And I interpreted that as aimed at this issue. Is that not true?
It is. And what's interesting, this is the conundrum Madison's in. On one hand, you have all of these people that if your house is on fire, they're going to come put that fire out. Yeah. They don't care if you're a Republican, a Democrat. They don't care if you're black, white, or otherwise. That is Madison. We will volunteer our time. We will step out of our way to help people. But then when we have to analyze the issues and how we might fit into how that exists, we approach it totally different. So on one hand, you have a mayor who deserves a lot of credit for the things that he's done in this city over the 40-plus years he's been in politics. But we're at a time now where we have to receive people differently. We have to tell everyone that, okay, we want you to be a part of our community, and these are our expectations, right? But that's not what we're doing. And so what's happened over these last 20 years in particular, where we started to close the employment gap into the mid-'80s, as soon as the whole drug thing started. You know, I lived in South Madison. We started to cast a shadow on South Madison. We started to cast a shadow on black men. Then you saw the tremendous increase very quickly in black men being incarcerated in our city, across our state. We then produced in 20 years a class of men who, and some of them are unemployable because they have records. We see them all the time. We cannot get some of these guys records for the slightest offenses because they have that on their record. They have that blemish. We saw poverty rates just skyrocket in our community. And we haven't had a policy solution, nor have we had a personal commitment on the part of the people of this community, which we need, to say enough already. We got to solve this problem.
Lisa, I want to get as much as sort of the personal aspect of this as we can. I'm reluctant to even bring up the fact that this is not a monolithic community like any other community, and yet we talk about it sometimes as if it is. But if we don't, if we start giving people an opportunity to separate out how this isn't true for all African Americans, they'll jump on that and ignore the problem completely. And I just wonder, within the African American community, how does a report like the Race to Equity report, how is that received?
You know, I wouldn't dare speak for the entire African American community because we are such a diverse group of people within and of ourselves. But what I would say is, you know, headlines such as the most racist city in the U.S. would not necessarily be shocking to people in the African American community. Of course, there would be those who may not agree with that, but I think overwhelmingly, folks understand what it means and they can relate to the underlying message. You put it best, the most racially disparate city in the country. Education, healthcare, health disparities. In my area of health disparities, they are shockingly huge gaps. And the question is why? We tend to know why. There's a feeling in the African American community that few people ask us our opinions about what's driving the disparities. We live in the reality of the disparity. We know what it feels like, sounds like.
Can we do something?
Yes.
Can we take a break and then come back, and I want you to finish that statement and tell us what it feels like right after this.
Good place to live for middle-class folks, and particularly for middle-class, well-educated white folks. For communities of color, particularly African-American communities, that's not so much the case. And so that's a tension within our community that I think is really important that we address.
The Race to Equity report that we've been talking about on this program, and Lisa, you were getting towards sort of, and again, I know you're not speaking for the entire African American, so forgive me for how this sounds, but the community's response to this, and the idea that many of you do know why.
Yeah, the community is not shocked by these headlines. We've been saying there are huge disparities and differences in how African American people experience life in Madison. I think that's a national conversation that we accept, that we experience life differently in the United States of America, and exceptionally so here in Madison. You hear it through the stories of people who are very qualified, educated, experienced, who either are from Madison or move here and struggle to find employment. You hear it in stories about how our children experience school and our school outcomes despite the kind of household that children come from, whether they come from stable two-parent, middle-income families or low-income single-parent or any combination thereof. We tend to find that our children don't fare as well. We've personally experienced many crises and challenges in local schools, and we've worked through that. We've chosen to volunteer and be a part of the solution, and that's really how people are, by and large, responding to it. They look at it, they nod at it, and they turn around and they go back to doing the work on the ground level that we've been doing for 20, 30, 40, 50 years in the African American community to solve our challenges on our own. We know that that's not always sufficient because structurally, we can't create the jobs. Some of them may be through small business, but we know that we're very challenged in the sense of small business development here as the African American community. Systemically, there have to be bigger solutions. The whole issue that you referred to in terms of adjudication of young people and diverting them from the juvenile justice system, and the same for adult males from the prison system. That starts really, a lot of it, on the ground with the issue of employment. If Black men are not able to secure family-supporting, family-sustaining jobs, that impacts the entire family system. It impacts the outcomes for Black women and Black children, and we see those outcomes in the community in terms of our children's behavior, how they engage in school, health disparities, the stress that not having stable, grounded employment puts on a family over time, and what that creates in terms of the quality of life in a home, but also now in a neighborhood and then an entire community, huge implications. So we have got to understand structurally outside of the African American community alone, which has been working. I stress that. I come from a community in Virginia, and I came into and adopted a second community, which has always been about creating solutions for itself, even when others weren't paying attention or willing to hear. And that's kind of people's attitude. We've got to keep plowing and doing the work, but God, would it be great to have some structural support to deal with those bigger issues that are outside of our control?
Well, I'm a little older than you two, but Kaleem, 40 years ago, we would be marching in the streets. Mm-hmm. Why are we not marching in the streets today? I
think partly people are tired. I think they're tired of hearing the disparities. I think you know, some people have gotten used to the fact that, and this is unfortunate, that some people are doing well and some people aren't. Some people have bought into the excuses as to why people are not succeeding. Some of them look like me, some of them look like you who believe that. And our sense of urgency just isn't there. It's not there on a lot of levels. But I'll tell you though, I feel like we also have to grasp a different vision for our community. And Madison is absent, but we don't have a vision. When I ask people around the community, you know, what is the vision for Madison? I would ask that when I first got here, so my job could be to get people plugged into that. No one could give it to me, not political leaders, not anyone. And so, you know, we decided on a vision that we're going to move with at the Urban League. Our vision is to ensure that the greater Madison region becomes the absolute best place for every single person to live, to learn, and to work in the Midwest by 2020. And so what we've been trying to do since then is to ensure that doors are open to employment, that doors are open through education, and through those we can address issues of housing, issues of issues of health, and all those other things if those folks have the right education and the right employment opportunities to succeed. So we have to do more of that. But I also tell these folks who come through our doors to get help, you better square up your shoulders right now. You better lift your head up and keep it up. I don't want to hear any excuses. The door is now open for you. You better walk through it and make the best of it, and we're going to help you as you get through it. Okay, look, I want to thank you both. I realize that I started by asking African Americans what we should do. I'm going to ask white people in the weeks to come, but I appreciate your letting me start with you two. Absolutely. We're going to come back and wrap up For the Record right after this. Thank you. My thanks to Kaleem and Lisa for being here today. We're going to continue to effort our discussion next Sunday morning at 10. We hope you'll join us. Have a good week, and we'll see you next Sunday.